welcome to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. We will start now with a very abridged About Us section. So a little bit about the Stewardship Network. We are a 501c3 organization with a 20-year award-winning history. Our webcasts happen each and every second Wednesday of the month at the 12 p.m. noon hour, or Eastern Time Zone's new hour. And then we are now serving 20 place-based TSN member communities, which you can learn more about on our website by visiting the member communities tab. So we exist to connect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water in their communities. So that is all of you trying to make sure that you are able to have the best impact that you can out in the field doing this great work. And one of the ways in which we do that is the Spring Challenge. You may remember the Spring Challenge having been the Garlic Mustard Challenge in the past few years, and then the Spring Invasive Species Challenge. And now we have a couple additional program details we would like to share with you. So again, looking at the history and impact, it's a major organizational push to increase the impacts of collaborative stewardship activities since 2008, formerly the Garlic Mustard Challenge, and then the Spring Invasive Species Challenge. And we've had 18,000 plus participants to date, over 2.3 plus million pounds of invasive plants removed, and over $6.7 million in work hour value. So what's new for 22? The Stewardship Network's annual Spring Challenge is back to make the 2022 field season of collaborative stewardship as impactful as possible. The program has 3 major pillars so that everyone can get involved at the level that's right for them. And thank you so much to our new communications director, Bob Zammit, for putting together this PowerPoint and also for putting together this great little logo for us. So the kickoff is April 13th, as in today, and the last reporting day is on July 5th. So the 3 pillars of the program are compete for TSN member communities and partner organizations and the big team as a whole. Then we have support for independent volunteers and donors, and we have celebrate for creatives and the community at large. So the compete pillar is the most similar to our previous challenges. Our friendly tournament of environmental stewards returns in 2022 to see which TSN member communities and partner collectives can do the most good for their local land and water. If you're not the competitive type, just think of it this way. By recording your stewardship hours, you're on the big team. We want to collect all of our collective impact and show it to the world. So regardless of whether you're competing with individual teams or as an individual, you're contributing to the total. So we're accepting a lot of different activities this year, including spraying, burning, monitoring, planting, and cleaning up. And what we offer in this program is the structure and the support, the visibility of participants' efforts. So we'll be sharing all of your successes via social media and email, and post-event metrics that you can use for grants, reports, etc. What we request from you is program participation, consistent, timely logs rather than submitting everything at the very end, and then promotions as appropriate, just helping us get the word out about this wonderful initiative. A couple different examples of the winners or the type of competitions we have: the Community Cup, which is the most hours logged within TSN; the Partner Cup, the most hours logged outside of TSN; the Root Cup, pounds of invasive species removed; and the Solo Cup, the most hours logged by an individual or single family. Moving on to the support pillar, we encourage you all to volunteer with a participating organization. You can visit our event calendar in order to find events in your area, or you can reach out to any local stewards organizations that you're aware of. And we also encourage you to donate to power the program financially, even if you can't be a part of it. We're rolling this up as a part of our spring drive that we used to do as a separate initiative. And so we always really appreciate your financial contributions. We could not do this work without you. And finally, the celebrate pillar: to create, share your photos, poems, paintings, songs, and other creative works, and we'll use them to energize the teams. And we encourage you, if you're ever posting on social media, either about the celebrate pillar or about the competition or even about making a donation, to use the hashtag TSN Spring, inspiring your family and your friends, family, and neighbors to volunteer with you, to match your donations, or just to include the hashtag. So if you go to get involved in the challenge, you can go to stewardshipnetwork.org/spring-challenge, You can get full program details, record your stewardship hours for competition, submit creative works for the event, and donate to power the cause. And now, without further ado, I think I did that 10-minute presentation in about 7 minutes. So forgive me if that was quick, but I do encourage you to go to stewardshipnetwork.org/spring-challenge to learn more about that. And we'll talk a little bit more at the end of the webcast in case anybody has some questions. But for now, I would like to turn it over to our guest today for the presentation, The Meadowlark Conundrum.
Fantastic. Well, thanks to the Stewardship Network, and thanks for everybody for being here. Love being involved with the Stewardship Network in whatever way that we can. Just like to introduce myself. My name is Mitch Lettow, Stewardship Director at the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy, and I'm joined by my friends and colleagues, Joanna Sblendorio, PhD candidate, and Dr. Sharon Gill, faculty member and researcher at the Department of Biology at Western Michigan University. And we also like to acknowledge that we are coming from the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Anishinaabe aligned Three Fires Confederacy tribes, and to honor their efforts as the original stewards of this landscape. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So I titled today's presentation, The Meadowlark Conundrum: Why Don't Many Prairie Restorations Support Declining Grassland Birds? So intentionally a little bit provocative, and I could have worded it as, why don't many of our prairie restorations support declining grassland birds? Because I can only speak to our own efforts. But that's what we plan to do today, is to kind of take you through our journey, grappling with that question in trying to, save this really important and charismatic group of animals. And so if I can get my slide advance. So I'd like to kind of start off by how we started thinking about this question. So the map on the left is one of the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy's most popular nature preserves. It's just east of the city of Kalamazoo in Southwest Michigan. And you can see different colors signifying different habitat zones. And in the upper left part of the map, and here's a drone view outlining a grassland restoration. And we've been working for years on this grassland restoration. We've been clearing invasive brush, trying to control woody vegetation, collecting seeds by hand, getting local genotypes from remnants and from other places on the preserve, trying to get the botany and the structure and everything just right, burning, brush hogging, doing site prep before planting, and all of this. And I was visiting it during June and July and just kind of admiring our efforts. Didn't see any, grassland birds of note, but I walked into what is the north kind of upper right corner of that image and talked to a neighbor who had a hay pasture there that they cut periodically to feed their horses. Talked to her, just chit-chatting, and said that they were getting ready to cut the hay the next week. And so as I was walking through their pasture, I flushed up the critter there in the upper right. And after my excitement of seeing not one, but 4 eastern meadowlarks, which I don't see a ton of these days, my mood kind of shifted to like, what gives? We've been working for years trying to make this, the best little patch of grassland, at least in this preserve as we could. And apparently they could care less about it. So it started kind of a personal journey of investigating these grassland restorations and whether they were actually doing the things that we hoped they would. And so that's what we hope to take you along with that question that we grappled with today. So we'll start off talking first about the loss of these grasslands and the birds that of course depend on those habitats. A big solution to the problem, which is grassland habitat restoration. And we'll talk about monitoring our efforts to actually see, who is using these restorations, what species are using them. And then what we're calling tweaks for tweets, improving grassland restorations for use for these declining species. And then along the way, we'll try to monitor in the chat for questions and maybe have time for questions and discussion at the end. And with that, I will hand it off to
Great, thank you, Mitch. Welcome everyone, thanks for having us here. So I'm going to start by just stepping back and make this point that one of the most pressing challenges that we have is biodiversity loss. And that could be the loss of species, of functions of those species, of ecosystems. And so we're interested in understanding how we could stem this loss and what its scale is and what the drivers of those losses are. We feel like we need a broad spectrum of people to be involved in quantifying the abundance of species and quantifying the loss of species. That includes the public, land managers, and scientists to all work together on this really pressing issue. The challenge is immense, and good data on species numbers can be hard to come by. So it's useful to look at easily counted and observed species to guide our knowledge. So birds have been called canaries in the coal mine for good reason in the past. What do we now know about bird declines, and how can we use them to foster knowledge about less well-known organisms? So you may have seen this image. This is a startling statistic that emerged from a study published in 2019. Now, we've known about bird declines for some time, but this study gave us a new way to appreciate the scale of the loss. Scientists used long-term and geographically widespread breeding bird surveys, so bringing in the public, land managers, and other scientists, plus the latest in radar technology to explore the numbers of birds that have been lost over time. They showed this staggering statistic of 2.9 billion birds that have been lost since 1970. That was their estimate of what we faced in what we face in terms of the loss of North American birds. Well, what's true is that there is this very large loss, so that's the estimate, but not all bird families or groups are affected to the same degree. What this pie chart shows are pies of the numbers of birds that are lost, and the total here is that 3.2 billion, but it's broken down by different bird groups. What you can see, hopefully the text is a bit small, American sparrows and wood warblers are the groups that have the largest share of that unfortunate pie. What's important to know is that even though they have the largest share, all of those named groups have experienced estimated losses of more than 50 million individuals. So being a thrush in the smaller slices of the pie is still a bad deal in this case. Now, fortunately, there is some good news that emerged from this study. And this little pie chart, it's put in context so that the numbers here are much smaller than the 3.2 billion. We're talking 250 million birds gained in some groups. And some of those groups include important birds like raptors. There's reasons for those increases, as well as waterfowl, ducks and geese in particular. So there is reason to be optimistic in some respects. Now, as we started our presentation with grassland birds and we noted the loss of sparrows in particular, we can also take a shift and look at these findings in the context of the habitats that they use. This will give us a different perspective. So are grassland birds in particular trouble? And so what these images from that paper show on the left-hand side, the change in abundance over time. So starting at 1970 to about 2020, a little bit less than that, 2018, I guess. And it shows lines that are illustrating the decline or relative stability for particular bird groups. At the top here are wetland species and coastal species that are showing relatively stable numbers. And there's a number of other habitat types that have relatively low changes. But this group at the bottom is obviously really concerning. And of particular concerns are these ones at the bottom, where we see these grassland birds that have been lost. And so this is a greater than 50% decline since 1970. And the proportion of species declining is shown in that pie chart, or all those pie charts. And for grassland birds, that's 75% of grassland species are declining. So of course, we have this big decline of grassland birds, and that isn't necessarily surprising. But of these 2.9 billion birds, the estimate is that 720 million of them are grassland species alone. Now, to put a fine point on it, and the reason in part why Mitch had mentioned he doesn't see meadowlarks as much anymore, is that the estimate is that 3 in 4 meadowlarks have been lost since 1970. So there's a reason for that change. Now, of course, the decline of birds is pretty obvious when we think about what's happened to grasslands. So in the US, we have the loss of grasslands due to a couple of different activities. So we know that settlers plowed the prairies that are then now our nation's breadbasket, so that's really important. And it's also critical to acknowledge that the process was really rapid and widespread, as it was because many tribes that were living and tending these lands were eliminated or forced to move. The grasslands that remained were not burned as they were historically, which also impacted their decline. Now, this led to then this really large decline of 96% of grasslands have been lost. And this image is specifically referring to Tallgrass Prairie. So 97% of 170 million acres of Tallgrass Prairie has been lost, leaving fragments and buffers and offering a dramatically altered landscape in return. Now, the reasons for these declines are, one of them is quite evident, as we've talked about already. We have habitat loss, where we have conversion of habitat through agriculture to development and forms of resource extraction. We also have degradation of those habitats, and that degradation can be from fragmentation, presence of invasive species, natural processes, including the woody plant succession in prairie regions, and pollution. There's also direct impacts on those species. And those direct impacts can include things like outdoor cats, collisions with buildings, pesticides causing mortality, and other forms of persecution. And of course, overlying all of those changes is climate change. So we have a suite of factors that are drivers of grassland bird declines. Now with that, I'll turn over to Mitch.
All right, thanks, Sharon. So Sharon outlined very eloquently the problem that we have, and that the problem of the loss of these species is obviously connected to the loss of their habitat. So it's a logical line of thinking that if we bring back the habitat, we can bring back the species, and perhaps kind of an obvious one. And it's interesting to think about restoration itself in the context of prairie or grassland restoration. Terms I'm using somewhat interchangeably here. So arguably the first grassland restoration experiment was conducted in 1934. And this occurred at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum in a place that's now called the Curtis Prairie, named after John T. Curtis, a famous botanist in Wisconsin. And as Alba Leopold was forming his land ethic, which we of course read about in the Sand County Almanac, very big book in the conservation movement, he and they collectively wanted to recreate the historic landscapes of Wisconsin, the historic plant communities, what they called Old Wisconsin. And that included in a large part Tallgrass Prairie. And so you can see here, they very much used kind of a civilian conservation corps model that was at that time planting trees kind of in a post-Dust Bowl era. And they're seen here using some improvised, fire flappers, what we would call now, and making what we call black line in a prairie, essentially creating a burn break so that the prairie could be burned off, which is an essential process in prairie function itself. So that's ongoing today, and it's arguably one of the first ecological restoration experiments that was actively documented. Jumping forward a few years here to 1974, Fermilab, if you're thinking, is that the Fermilab that I'm thinking of, the the Particle Acceleration Laboratory, maybe they should call it the Prairie Acceleration Laboratory, actually had 3 acres of what was an incredibly rare prairie remnant at that time. And because of their immense agricultural productivity, tallgrass prairie remnants were exceedingly rare. So having 3 acres of that might sound small, but it was incredibly significant. And a local professor from Northeastern Illinois University, Bob Betts, approached the Fermilab with a proposal to conduct this prairie restoration on their grounds. And it was approved and embraced very much. And now the prairie is over 1,000 acres in size. And much of that came from collecting seeds by hand from prairie remnants here and there, being very, very patient. This is before we knew how prairie restorations worked. Being patient and having hope that those seeds would take root, eventually burning them off and reintroducing those important processes. And throughout this time, there were other prairie restorations happening, but they were very much sort of on a local scale, and that information was kind of held with individual land managers and very much from a practitioner standpoint. And it wasn't until the late 80s and early 90s that restoration ecology was recognized as a formal academic discipline. And William Jordan is one of the founders of the Society for Ecological Restoration, was from Wisconsin, also involved with the Arboretum heavily, worked there for 25 years, and was instrumental in forming this society. And it was very much rooted in prairie restoration. So this is now a global organization that helps support 2 scientific journals, perhaps more, and share this sort of information exchange about how we're restoring the Earth's habitats and ecosystems. And it all started in these sort of humble beginnings of Midwestern prairie restoration. And I recently learned that we're actually in the decade that the United Nations has declared the decade on ecosystem restoration. And so at this point, I think making it to that scale really indicates to me that restoration ecology is woven into the fabric of what we call conservation today. And so it's come a long way and really came from pretty humble roots in prairie restoration. So we have a really rich, colorful history in prairie restoration to build from if we're trying to restore these prairies and grasslands for the benefit of grassland birds and others. And so today, frankly, if you have the resources and you have the land, often there's these post-agricultural areas that are relatively straightforward in terms of the information, the resources available to restore into something like a grassland. So this is the first growing season in a grassland restoration that we conducted near the Kalamazoo River. And this one in particular was funded by the Conservation Reserve Program, which is a program of the Farm Service Agency and the USDA. And as kind of a metric of how much of this is going on, I looked in their current numbers for 2020, and over 900 million acres are enrolled in CRP. And so this is designed to take sensitive environmental areas out of agricultural production, or areas that are no longer productive. And the bulk of these areas are in some kind of grassland mix. Of course, they're all disconnected and across the country, but an impressive number nevertheless. We literally have a handbook on how to do these restorations. This was a really important resource for me getting involved in this field and in this work. And I still reference it today, the Tallgrass Restoration Handbook. Again, coming out of Illinois and the Midwest in particular, looking at prairies, savannas, and oak woodlands, all the techniques that had been learned over the years and documented and memorialized in this resource. Locally, in our little corner of the world, we have commercial seed companies. These are 2 great ones that we've worked with locally. And you can get a prairie in a bag. It's kind of amazing. So before, where folks would have had to go out to individual remnants and collect seeds by hand and would have had to scale up the acreage very incrementally. And those activities still have a lot of value, and in particular for preserving local genotype. But commercially, it's almost a turnkey process at this point to establish some kind of prairie. And talk about a lot of these smaller scale restoration efforts, farmer landowner scale, on the scale that we work on. But there are some really incredible large scale prairie restorations happening across the country too. In terms of distance from where we are in Southwest Michigan, Kankakee Sands in Indiana, 8,000 acres, Meadowlark and Tallgrass Prairie with the Forest Service in Illinois, 18,000 acres. And as I was looking for, what is the biggest tallgrass prairie restoration, it's claimed to be the Joseph H. William Tallgrass Prairie in Oklahoma, which is almost 40,000 acres of restoration. So it seems that we're doing well. We have a lot of resources. We have a lot of restorations to look to, but we're still seeing these declines of these birds, of course. And so in our little corner, we are doing our part. So we have about 350 acres and some kind of grassland restoration across 12 different preserves. And we have various motivations for doing these. And we're using the recommended techniques, using no-till drills to seed in thatch after a site is prepped and probably sprayed and that sort of thing to establish the prairie. We're reintroducing fire that hasn't been an element that hasn't been seen in the landscape and is so essential to prairie since oftentimes the Anishinaabe were burning these landscapes in various places, over 100 years ago. And then we're coming up with things that look like this. You walk out in these places and they're inspiring and it feels like you're doing something right. And so as we would go visit these places, we'd see a bobolink or a Henslow sparrow and get really excited, and say yay and pat ourselves on the back and, seem like we were doing the right thing. But then other times they would go out and we wouldn't see them, or certain years we wouldn't see those birds. And so we started to kind of scratch our heads and try to think through that process of why we're not seeing those birds in all cases. And just frankly asking ourselves, are the declining grassland bird we're targeting using our grassland restorations? And so luckily we found a grant that could support answering a question or starting to answer a question like this. Unfortunately, most grants really like to see some kind of sexy transformational change, prairie restoration, planting, that sort of thing, but less often can we get funding to actually monitor and survey those places. And so luckily the Land Trust Alliance teamed up with Cornell and formed this Land Trust Bird Conservation Initiative. And they supported us, happy to say, doing just that. So we did undertake restoration activities that are critical to maintaining these disturbance-dependent habitats, but we also made surveying and long-term monitoring really key parts of the grant as well. And with that, I'll hand it off to Joanna.
Excellent, thank you, Mitch. All righty, get it situated here, and I'll just say next on each slide. Okay, so we have all this anecdotal evidence of those declining grassland birds at our preserves, but the issue is, as Mitch mentioned, that there isn't consistent data to show how birds are responding to management efforts. So we developed a protocol for standardized bird monitoring surveys. And we have 16 managed sites. These are consisting of a mosaic of habitat types, including grasslands. We had between 1 and 8 survey points per site. So they were at least 300 meters apart or more, depending upon the site area. There are 52 survey points total across all sites. And we did 3 surveys per site across the breeding season. So that was May 31st to July 7th. And this corresponds to the annual North American breeding bird survey period. So we wanted to spread out our site visits to account for variation in timing of breeding activities among species. Next. Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit about our survey protocol. The surveys were conducted between sunrise and 11 a.m. to capture that optimal window of singing activity. We surveyed on mild weather days. That was nice for us and also pleasant for the birds. So days with low wind, less than 12 miles per hour, no precipitation. We avoided loud anthropogenic noise, such as traffic or lawn machinery. And so the surveys themselves were 10-minute, unlimited distance point counts, where we recorded all birds seen and heard within the time period. And finally, one aspect of these surveys that I really want to highlight here is that the data collection was done via smartphone on the eBird mobile app. So this was so beneficial to us because it meant no data sheets, no data entry after surveying, storage for our data within eBird that we could really access anytime we wanted. And it also allowed us to contribute citizen science data to eBird. So really it was a win-win. And I also want to mention here that if anyone's interested in our protocol or would like to learn more, we're happy to share the document that we've created and that we currently use. Next. All right, so in year one, which was 2020, that Cornell grant supported 2 field technicians who completed 156 point count surveys. So the goal of these surveys was to establish a baseline bird community and that baseline data that can be compared to future surveys and then inform adaptive management strategies. So starting in 2021, we actually continued the bird monitoring by transitioning to an entirely volunteer-based survey system. So the Land Conservancy partnered with local organizations to find birders to adopt sites for the breeding season. Of course, the volunteer surveys come with their own set of challenges, but we successfully completed a second survey year exclusively with those volunteer efforts. So these surveys also fostered stronger connections between the birding community and also the Land Conservancy. And they even raised awareness of Land Conservancy properties through those submitted eBird checklists. So this was a really positive outcome. Next. Okay, so now I'll transition into results and what's actually going on at these preserves. So this is a map of the sites we surveyed across 4 counties in Southwest Michigan. And across all 16 sites, the sites included various habitat types, and we found more than 5,700 birds observed, representing 89 different species. Next. So those species included some that are of special concern in Michigan, including, and I'll go clockwise here, red-headed woodpeckers, hooded warblers, osprey, and then endangered Henslow sparrow. And then I'll also mention that we also found 7 species that are considered common birds in steep decline in North America. So examples like yellow-billed cuckoo, chimney swift, common grackle, and then of course our eastern meadowlarks. Next. Okay, so this baseline survey year gave us a sense of the quality of these preserves for grassland birds. And at some survey points within grasslands, we also detected birds more typical of forest, shrub, and edge habitats. So here we show Chipman Preserve and the 8 points that we surveyed there as an example. So some points are purposely within forest, but in those grassland points, you can see that there's edge habitat that's present in each. So this really reveals that these grassland sites are small and they may not attract or support certain species. So some grassland specialists are area sensitive, meaning that population densities increase as grassland area increases. So these small grasslands may not be supporting the necessary territory sizes for certain species. And then also predator communities may differ between small and large grasslands or could potentially depend on proximity to woodland edge. So this could affect settlement decisions. And this also highlights the challenges of doing grassland restoration in states that have lots of forested area. So our preserves occur within this habitat mosaic with habitat fragments and few large grassland areas. Next. Okay, so of our 52 survey points across all sites, 23 of them were within grassland or savanna habitat where grassland species could potentially be found. So despite the fragmentation across the landscape, we did find 6 grassland specialist species using our sites. So numbers next to the species names are representing the number of those grassland points where each target species was observed. So to get into those species, our endangered Henslow sparrows were found at 2 sites, which had grasslands that were greater than 50 acres in size, had warm season grasses, lots of thatch, and recent oak plantings. The bobolinks were at 2 sites within grassland restorations that were wet. It had an abundance of sedges and then those cool season grasses. And I want to note that there were particularly high bobolink counts in one recently burned grassland. And then eastern meadowlarks were found in very low numbers, with only 3 sightings across the survey period in 2020. And they were seen at 2 sites, one of those being a 12-acre pasture that's harvested annually, and then a wet grassland restoration, the same area that we found bobolinks. Next. Okay, so horned lark and vesper sparrow were both seen once in the same recently planted prairie restoration. So this site was still sparse with open ground, and it was within an agricultural landscape, but both species are unlikely to be found in subsequent years as the prairie matures. And then finally, sedge wrens were found at one preserve that had wet, tall, and very dense grassland. So the presence of these species indicates that these sites have quality habitat for grassland birds, but still our target species were present at relatively few sites, which leads us to wonder why that might be. Okay, next. So this is one of our sites, Waukena, which is in Van Buren County, Michigan. And this is a historic forested wetland that had been cleared and then planted for prairie restorations. These restorations are wet, and they have an abundance of sedges and those cool season grasses, which are green in early spring. So we have 5 survey points here. 2 of them, M1 and M2, are entirely in grassland, and then 3 of the points are either in shrubland or open woodland. So one grassland point, M1, which is in the top right there, was recently burned before the 2020 surveys and was clear of woody vegetation. So this preserve provides an excellent example of a habitat mosaic where forest and shrub edge species were detected alongside those grassland specialists and grassland generalist species. Next. Okay, so for example, at the restored grassland points, those M1 and M2, we detected open woodland species, so things like northern cardinals, cedar waxwings, and warbling vireos. But we also had grassland generalists like barn and tree swallows, and then common yellowthroat. And of course, we had our target grassland specialists, including bobolink and eastern meadowlark. So at M1, which is the recently burned point, and also M2, which was a wet grassland point, bobolinks were found in high numbers throughout the survey period. So that was about 4 to 5 individuals on average. And although we aren't reporting on second-year survey results today, it's interesting to note that bobolinks weren't seen in as high of numbers in the 2021 survey period. So in the case of eastern meadowlark, there was only a single sighting, which doesn't indicate that they're breeding at this particular site. So this data across years can help us to monitor population trends and make management decisions to expand preferred habitat and increase grassland connectivity. So we then began thinking on a more micro level of why grassland specialists may or may not be using these particular restorations. Next. And I'll move back to Mitch.
Great. Thanks, Joanna. So Joanna did a great job of pointing out how the surveys themselves led us to start looking at site by site, scratching our heads, thinking about why some of these target species were occurring at some sites and not others. And we didn't do a formal study to be able to say for sure why they occurred at some areas and not others, or why they were in such low numbers. But we can start to explore some of the requirements for these birds and take you along our line of thought as to what we think are some of the key issues that we'd like to address in our work to try to support more grassland birds in the future. So I thought a great way to do that would be to show 4 grassland species and to show their habitat requirements in just the sort of range of habitat requirements that they have within the grassland sort of biome, general ecosystem. So litter, or thatch as it's often called in prairies, is essentially the buildup of dead vegetation from the previous year. So if you're planting in a formerly row crop field, it will take several years before you develop a litter component. If you've recently done a burn, that will also take several years to develop a litter component. But there are many species that are responsive to the amount of litter and have specific requirements. So to kind of show you the range, we have killdeer, we have eastern meadowlark, we have northern harrier, which is a grassland raptor, and then we have Henslow's sparrow. And sort of starting from left to right, Killdeer we know to be, very adaptable in an urban and rural landscape. We sometimes see them on ball diamonds and, backyards and rural areas, field edges, that sort of thing. So, and they're often nesting in areas where there's lots of bare ground. So it makes sense their litter requirement is pretty low. And going to eastern meadowlark and northern harrier, they're somewhere in the middle. They like some thatch, but not a ton. For the northern harrier, which feeds almost exclusively on small rodents and voles, their prey base is going to need some kind of cover, and that thatch is particularly important for rodents to be able to use the habitat. So if the food's not there, they won't be there. Makes sense. And then Henslow sparrow on the high end, they do like a higher amount of thatch than most birds. So you likely won't see them, even if you have all the right seed mix and all the right habitat structure planned for your grassland restoration. You're not likely to see them until maybe year 4 or 6 or even 7. If you do a burn, you're likely that you're not going to see them until year 3, perhaps. And then another important element that Joanna touched on is this minimum acreage or area sensitivity. So again, starting from left to right, killdeer, have a pretty low minimum acreage. They're pretty adaptable to changing sort of mosaic of landscape makeup. Eastern meadowlarks are somewhat area sensitive, but not particularly, maybe 25 acres. We mentioned that they were found in a 13-acre pasture in one of our surveys. Then jumping up, the northern harrier is very much an area sensitive species, again, tying probably back to that prey base. Just being a top predator in the food web, they're going to need a much larger area to support an effective breeding cycle. And then Henslow sparrows are sort of moderately area sensitive and are thought to occur mostly in grassland patches that are, 40, 70 acres, maybe a minimum. And again, this varies across the literature, but these are generalizations. And then thinking about the actual green vegetation that's in those prairies, some of the structure in the living plants and what those species prefer in terms of that. So killdeer are gonna like really short vegetation. Again, we said, ball fields and railroad tracks and that sort of thing. So, a couple of inches and pretty sparse with a lot of bare ground. So naturally, they'd be coming in right after a disturbance, a big fire or a herd of bison coming in or something like that. Then kind of moving up in scale, eastern meadowlark and northern harrier are somewhat similar in their requirements for structure, tend to like more grass dominated or graminoid dominated habitats of kind of medium height, sort of this Goldilocks, not too short, not too tall. And then Henslow sparrows prefer a little bit taller vegetation. Often they're seen in some of these warm season grass prairie restorations, but they do like some forbs and some structure within for perching and singing and that sort of thing. And so kind of moving on from those micro scale considerations, Joanna talked about the area sensitivity concept, and I'd like to just sort of display that among 2 of our preserves that we sampled during our survey. The preserve on the left is mostly a forested wetland complex, and along the northeast boundary, there are a series of scattered prairie plantings that were, in part to buffer a waterway for water quality purposes, but we surveyed them for grassland birds nevertheless. And so they range from 4 to 24 acres in size, and you can see they're kind of disconnected and their shape is more linear. So it has more edge than area, as opposed to if you reformulated that entire area into one square, which would be generally considered better for grassland birds. And then by contrast, the Joaquina preserve that she mentioned where we've seen the bobolinks has larger grassland patches than the image shown on the left, ranging in size from 25 and 50 acres. And you can see how they're oriented. They're sort of stacked onto each other to increase that area and reduce that edge. And they are more connected in general. And so these observations are also supported by the literature that most of these grassland specialist birds are considered to be area sensitive. And this varies by species. And these species are also sensitive to fragmentation or sort of orientation of this habitat in space. Then landscape really matters. So It's not obviously something that's easy to change, but it can help to sort of set expectations and could drive conservation decisions if we're trying to really target grassland birds in particular. So the image on the left shows one of our preserves that had a relatively large grassland restoration compared to some of the others, and with some of the surrounding efforts of the Department of Natural Resources, who owns the land around this preserve, you know, it's probably in the neighborhood of maybe 70-acre grassland restoration. But if you look in the surrounding landscape, it is almost completely forested, you know, 90% plus forested. So for species that evolved in open environments where tree lines were very, very far away or non-existent, tree lines often can mean that you're not going to see as high of a density of those birds, or they may not choose to breed there. And so contrast that with this small preserve that's about 38 acres in size, and the actual pasture itself is only about 13 acres. But what you notice about the larger landscape is that it occurs in more of an agricultural matrix. So there are some row crop in this area. You can see there are some woodlots and things like that. There are some pastures as well. And so the fact that we saw eastern meadowlarks at this preserve, and being such a tiny preserve, we know they have area requirements. This is supported by the literature as well, to the point where if you're trying to attract the same species of bird to two different habitats, and one is in a forested setting and one is in an open setting, the patch in your forested setting is going to need to be that much bigger to be able to attract that species. And so, yeah, this is supported by the literature and forested landscapes. So just generally, you're going to have to be working on a larger scale if you're trying to target those species. And then kind of bringing it all together, think of this as sort of our thoughts in terms of management implications for folks who are stewarding or creating or protecting these grassland areas. And these are sort of some of our recommendations and some of our thought processes. So if we're thinking about birds like the bobolink, getting into that micro scale vegetation, the first thing I would say is pick a target species. You know, picking a target species can allow you to try to tweak the habitat in particular to make it reflect that species needs. You know, I think in the past, we have used a bit of a copy and paste model with prairie restorations and seed mixes. And I really advocate for careful thinking through that. When you're preparing your seed mix, it can often be more economical to use a higher warm season grass component. But I would say, if possible, use those big three warm season grasses: switchgrass, big blue stem, and Indian grass. Use them very carefully and perhaps in lower amounts, because if you're not burning during the growing season, or you're not burning in the fall, you're not grazing, you may have a tough time controlling the strong amount of competition that they bring to your grassland. And it can simplify the structure of it to the detriment of grassland birds. Hydrology can make a big difference. Joanna mentioned that our most productive site for bobolinks was essentially a historic wetland. And that hydrology supported an abundance of sedges and rushes and created that cool season graminoid component that bobolinks like. And then mostly we think about how are we managing these places. So as stewards and land managers, think about the disturbance regime. There's this idea that pyrodiversity equals biodiversity. And what that means is that if you vary the types of burns that you do, the seasonality, the size, we should be rotating around through these grassland units. We will be encouraging a variety of habitat structure. And even better, if we can use grazing or incorporate grazing into this disturbance regime. There's a lot of great research out there on this concept of patch burn grazing. I really encourage you to look into that, where you burn an area and then cattle or bison preferentially graze those areas before moving on. And it creates this amazing diversity of structure and productivity in the grassland that supports a diversity of species. So then started scaling up to the meso scale, patch size. So kind of reviewing that, bigger grasslands essentially are going to be better in most cases. Obviously, your site is your site. If it can't grow, it can't grow. But some ways to functionally grow a grassland size would be to soften or remove woody edges, old fence rows or tree rows, or work with neighbors. So obviously the birds don't care about property lines. If your neighbor can manage a pasture, a grassland, or start a grassland restoration, maybe you can help them out. You can functionally grow the size of the area, and you may be able to attract grassland species that are area sensitive. And then I'll kind of end with this set of recommendations and thoughts, thinking about the macro scale. So thinking about that landscape. Again, this isn't necessarily something that we can change. It may change where we choose to work potentially if we're talking about conservation agencies, but restoring in open landscapes is going to be easier in terms of attracting and retaining higher densities of grassland birds. Certainly not impossible in a forested landscape. That's basically the landscape that we work in Southwest Michigan. So definitely not impossible, but just some added challenges. And then there's no way we can reverse the decline of grassland birds without the help and the cooperation of our farmer friends. So agriculture has to be part of the solution. There are things like delaying harvests to allow grassland birds to be able to fledge, have enough time to fledge before hay is harvested. When hay is harvested, we can use things like flushing bars that allow birds to get out of the way before that harvest begins. And then things like rotational or mob grazing have a very high impact, but for a short amount of time, and then give the grassland a period of rest that can fit a window of a breeding cycle of certain grassland birds within that rest period while still producing an agricultural product. So from there, I want to kind of leave you hopefully with some hope. So as Emily Dickinson said, hope is a thing with feathers. And I think in terms of trying to make grassland restorations better, trying to do more of them and trying to reverse this decline, I would argue that we're in a really good scenario currently in terms of funding to do that. So if you actually look back in the Stewardship Network archives, I think it was last fall, there was a presentation about Recovering America's Wildlife Act, or RAWA. And essentially, this is going to be a really big deal for funding wildlife conservation and restoration, where endangered species funding and game species funding sort of leave off all of the rest of the species. That's where this act would come in. And they've got a meadowlark on their logo, for gosh sake. So that's going to be a big game changer. That's been introduced in the House and has a bunch of co-sponsors. So write your representatives saying that you support these efforts. You may have heard of the 30 by 30 and the corresponding 50 by 50 vision. And this is the idea that in the US and in the world, we need to preserve 30% of the land and water by 2030 and 50% of the land and water by 2050. And so this was introduced by former Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico, and the Biden administration has made an initial executive order showing commitment to it. But essentially, this would really scale up conservation efforts and in large part bolster private land conservation as well. And then as I was putting this together, I literally got an email yesterday about this thing called the America the Beautiful Challenge. And there is something in the order of $450 million over the next 5 years to accelerate efforts to conserve, forests and grasslands and wetlands, thinking about, sort of natural green infrastructure boosted by the infrastructure bill. So it's a really exciting time to be doing this work. And I would say all three of these things are, in our near future, hopefully going to become a reality. So write your local congressperson. And then I'll end on kind of this thought that, Sharon pointed out in the decline of some of those birds with that Rosenberg study, that there were some increases. So for the past 50 years, we've actually reversed the decline of waterfowl, and we've preserved wetlands, and we have all these great groups, nonprofits, non-governmental organizations working with agencies, to the point where every pickup truck that I see driving down the road in Kalamazoo has a Ducks Unlimited logo on the back of it. Ducks and waterfowl have cultural value. And so I would ask the question, why can't we make the meadowlark the new mallard? how cute would that be to have a Meadowlark sticker right next to the mallard? So I'll end with that kind of hopefully happy, silly thought there and leave you with some resources. If you'd like to reach out to us and use our protocol or look at our protocol, feel free to email us. These are our corresponding websites if you're interested to see what we're doing to support birds in our area. I want to acknowledge and thank the folks at the Land Trust Bird Conservation Initiative. And then we reference a lot of great science going out there supporting our decisions. And so we wanted to certainly acknowledge those sources and happy to share those as well. And so with that, I think we're got about 5 minutes here before 1. So I have not been monitoring the chat, so I don't know if Rob, you want to help kind of cue some things up for me if there were any questions or concerns?
Absolutely. So thank you so much to all the presenters and to the co-presenters who have been vigilant about answering questions in the chat as they've come up. One that I think may not have been answered, but I'll just ask it just in case. But it was a question from Heidi saying, can you speak for the larger landscape? For example, some restoration sites are more situated in landscapes with more suitable habitat in the larger landscape versus others that may have less valuable sites nearby. So did you take into account any of the kind of surrounding areas of these test sites, I guess?
We did not. So these are kind of, speculations and then drawing on the literature about why some of these species may be occurring. But yeah, I would say the main take home point from the literature and from kind of what we saw in our efforts are that it may help to kind of set expectations. If you're working in a very forested landscape, you're going to probably need to have a larger grassland restoration to be able to attract some of those species or to support higher densities of them. And if you're working in an open grassy landscape, so places like the Dakotas are going to be easier to bring in those grassland species than a place like Michigan, where everything kind of defaults to forest with our amount of rainfall that we get. So I don't know if that answered Heidi's question, but I think I see a thank you. So hopefully.
That's perfect. And with that, I would actually, I'm going to take us out into our outro slides, but I wanted to once again, thank you so much to Mitch and Sharon and Joanna for being a part of this. Such a wonderful presentation. We're getting a lot of great feedback in the chat. So thank you very much. And then allow me to navigate to my shared screen real quick. So then before you all go, we just wanted to give a quick little recap about the Spring Challenge. So first of all, it's happening now until July 5th. And we encourage you to report early and often to motivate your peers. The more consistent data that we get, the easier it will be for us to get everybody excited, show you updates and lead changes and all those things. So please do be vigilant about reporting soon after you complete any restoration activities. And this challenge is for everybody. We want to make sure that everybody knows that with the expanded categories, creative works, and with the donations, everybody in the network has a chance to get involved. And last but not least, please make sure to use the TSN Spring hashtag. And thank you so much for spreading the word. Forms are now live, so you can get out there and start checking it out at stewardshipnetwork.org/spring-challenge. Get full program details, record your stewardship hours for competition, submit your creative works, and donate to power the cause. And thank you all so much for joining us. Our next webcast is on May 11th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. And again, my name is Rob Luzinski. We really appreciate you for being here. Thank you.